Hey everyone, I'm Sophia Says, and we're in my studio here today in Brooklyn, New York to discuss the making of my upcoming debut album titled Self, which is being released on the Brooklyn-based label Kingdoms this spring. The record is split into two parts, being released on cassette, roughly 30 minutes each part. I chose this format because the album has a sort of lost tape feel to it. For the purposes of this video today, I'll only be focusing on the first part of the album. As well, due to the length of the record, I'm going to be taking a wider creative approach from a more sound design perspective rather than an engineering angle. My production process really varies depending on the style of the project that I'm creating. I don't really have a formulaic method of working. I've had various aliases over the years, and I always try to allow the music first and foremost to dictate the method and approach that I'm going to take. I guess I'm more known for producing techno music, but while I love the genre, like any other genre, producing it for many years, it can become a bit linear or stagnant. My background is actually in classical music, so for this record, stylistically, I chose to stray a bit more off-kilter, applying techniques that I aggregated over the course of many years. I chose to create a 1 hour long piece for the album with no breaks versus a track-to-track interpretation. The reason for that being is I feel that the element of patience is very much a lost commodity in our musical generation. So the idea here was really that if you're not able to sit through the whole thing and the entirety of it and absorb everything that's happening in the full essence, then you're not really going into it with the right mindset to begin with. I typically jam for a few hours before diving into any project. I'm a keyboard player, so a lot of that is comprised of me playing piano for a few hours to generate some hooks I'm vibing with, and I then add on other instruments later. So definitely the harmonic personality of the song comes first for me, and later the rhythm section kind of brings all of that to life. My gear setup is quite limited, as you will see. I am an avid believer of efficiency in workspaces and building your collection slowly over time. I have been in so many expensive studios over the years that are drizzling in fancy gear, of which little to none is used. Generally, I'll record a live jam session to get the idea across and later spend some time cleaning up the files. The way I sketched this record was a series of live jams over the course of 48 hours or 2 days. I then spent a few months cleaning up the files later on, of course, and reshaping all the sounds to really get a crisp effect. I work primarily in Logic. I really enjoy the environment. I don't think it really matters what DAW you're using. It's all the same language, just different dialects, really. The record is comprised of about 30 different songs, so for the video today, I'm going to be browsing through various sessions as we go along. So let's dive into the first song on the album. I'm going to be playing the main loop of the introduction. I froze all the channels just to save some CPU for the tutorial. Together, the introduction sounds something like this. So first off, I rarely ever slap anything on the master, especially a limiter. A simple rule of thumb I like to use is that I try to keep the project as clean as possible as I'm working along before I get into mixing. And this is mainly to allow myself enough headspace for mastering later on instead of crunching all the levels in the preliminary phase. I think you can always make quiet sounds louder, but if the bounce components are already too loud, you can't ever really go back. Particularly distortion, I think it's so aggressively applied sometimes, so I try to steer away from that to the best of my ability. So once I get a general loop flowing, I spend most of my time configuring the arrangement. As you can see here, I prefer arranging in a chronological order versus instrument categories. It's just a personal preference. Textures are especially important to me in any project that I'm working on. I use these to sort of set the tone for the message that I'm trying to get across and convey a general feeling. I also like to tune the texture so it really pushes the frequencies of everything else that's happening and just meshes together in a really nice balanced way. And I use stock Logic plugins like the pitch shifter to tune everything accordingly. In this project, I have about 7 different layers, including some vocal bits. These are all field recordings that are sort of reminiscent of the mood that I was trying to get across. Together, it sounds something like this. I used a lot of almost ASMR style up-close mic recording techniques to achieve getting intimate sounds sonically. So simple things like this, taking physical objects and directly rubbing it on or near the microphone. And then of course rerunning those sounds and processing it through multiple pedals to affect it accordingly. I tend to like up-close mic recording techniques because there's a certain level of intimacy again that you can't really get digitally. And then I play with the EQ to make sure that the frequencies are as lush as possible. And I also try to use samples that are reminiscent of whatever memory is in mind. For example, the first section, I have footsteps of me running through the rain. And I think altogether with the rest of the track, it sounds pretty effective. There's also a section where I sampled a voicemail from someone, and then I used granular synthesis to sort of stretch the file and turn it into almost ambient rain textures. Onwards and Upwards were now the second song of the album. And all of the percussives in this song are from my TRA, which I've now consolidated. And I apply a bit of Bit Crusher to almost all of my percussion along with other distortion tools. And I try to put a filter on the top to cut out the higher frequencies, have it set to pretty high cutoff. It sounds like this. And I always try to make sure that the bass frequencies are weaving in and out of the percussion, especially if it's a static bass roll. You want to give it as much dynamic and depth. I always make sure to keep the panning of my bass just down the middle. This allows the bass line to move while still maintaining this sort of pumping essence. As well here in the bass line, I've added a ring shifter with a filter on top, again to cut out the higher, more troublesome frequencies. I use a lot of automation as the track swells. Additionally, I like to really detune all the keys and just overall granulate the sounds to make it sound like a very wonky, broken, vintage piano. I applied the pitch shifter over the filtered sequence, the tremolo as well, just at the tail end to really heighten the depth and some more modulation. Another thing though is that while there are a lot of layers, all the layers are chopped and faded, so the percussion kind of weaves into each other and it avoids things sounding stacked or too busy. I think the first time I was really compelled by music was the first time that I learned what a dynamic feel truly is. And in that moment, I really envisioned music visually. So now when I record or when I mix music, I think about music in a very sort of visual setting in a way that's super tangible. And so I imagine everything just directly in front of me in an actual field or forest or whatever environment you feel comfortable envisioning music in. And this really helped me better understand what goes where, when, whether that be horizontally, vertically, or most importantly, how far each sound is projecting depth-wise. Again, all the piano parts you're hearing here are recorded with my iPhone. I purposely left the recordings this way just for the purposes of maintaining a more honest sound, as if you're sitting next to me in the studio versus a polished feel. I even left the sound of me sort of breathing heavily as I was playing, just intentionally to make it sound more organic. I then used a lot of interludes or transitions rather to usher the song from one into another. Naturally, your ears would become quite tired after listening to 1 hour's worth of content, so I did that to sort of break things up. So essentially, they're just a series of layered field recordings that I've combined into sort of consistent pieces, about 15 seconds to 30 seconds each part. Another thing worth noting here is my use of reverse vocals that are embedded throughout the record. You're not really able to hear or interpret what is being said lyrically, but I think sometimes subliminal messaging like that can go a really far away, a long way rather. It sort of projects a certain mood or tone, which is way more important sometimes than just the words that are being dictated. So I have one about 3 songs in that sounds something like this. In the next song, I'd say the more standout facet is the polyphonic vocal sampling. The original is actually from a Georgian folk orchestra where I'm originally from. And I just applied a quarter tremolo array to give it more of a quivering sound. And as well, I just sort of detuned the notes. I think with the effects and processing, it floats a lot nicer over the rest of the song. It sounds like this. I'm particular about the chaining of the effects. In the key section here, I ordered the delay designer over the pitch shifter, which is being fed from the filter. This way the output is more obscure than stagnant. I also like to use delays on almost all my melodies. The delay designer is pretty fantastic in Logic, and again, just a stock Logic plugin. Right, so just creates more movement in the body of the audio and just more of a bulging sound rather than just a linear output. You'll notice that most of my plugins are stock Logic, but one company I really like to use is Denise. I find a lot of their products are just to the point, not overly complex, and with my recording style being quicker or hashing out ideas while the inspiration is still fresh in my mind, their suite works pretty effectively for me. Here I've used their saturation tool, which I highly recommend for everyone to try. It's quite useful in almost all of my projects. A trick I like to use for interludes especially is taking the tail end of an ambient sound like the rain sample here, for example, applying a sharp echo to the tail end of it, and then using the reverb that is being carried over, that's drizzling over from the other elements as well to sort of usher in the transition of the next song. So again, just using the automation on the effects itself. I have a pretty specific taste for acid patterns. I don't really like when they're obvious or recognizable, so I try to always compensate with substantial effects, as you can see here. The strings in the next part are probably my favorite bit of the album chord-wise. I applied an arpeggio, a chromatic scale to the arpeggio, so essentially there's 12 pitches, each a semitone above and below its adjacent pitch. I used the New York compressor plugin from Denise on the drums here. It's a super powerful plugin. I used to apply New York or just direct parallel compression manually, but what I really like about this plugin is that it allows me to precisely tune the compression for punchier effect, since it has this continuous RMS time control feature, while generic compressors do not. It also allows me the option to choose between different timbres, dark, natural, or bright. I like to automate reverb or delays from just the tail end of a track to leak over short bridges where everything else is muted. Small breaks or even reverse kicks, for example, on the first downbeat can make for a very powerful impact. Another neat trick I like to use is taking a wet reverb recording, reversing it, and putting it just ahead of the vocal track to give it a sucking crescendo effect. Also bypassing effects just at the start of a file using fades for extra swing. These kind of small automation tricks are subtle but go a long way in the overall mix. The vocals in the next song have a lot of vocal processing, automation, and just pitch shifting overall to have a very creepy, bizarre type tone with darker subtones from the Alchemy plugin, which I use a lot of. You'll notice the rotor cabinet on the vocals, which turn on at the end of the sample and create this sort of drowning effect. And I use that just at the tail bit of it. And then I have these poetry bits that are drizzled throughout the record, and it sort of speaks to the overall theme of the album. I automated the master tempo pretty sharp in this section to sway the movement of the vocals, and the high-pitched bits I processed through various pedals. And then EQ different frequencies until I found a sound I was content with. And overall, it made for a really interesting output. It sounds something like this.
A flower that frowns and dies. Why if everything in its white lies? What is a flower if?
So let's move on to the next song. In this one, I spent a lot of time chopping the drums. Instead of sidechaining, what I did was I sampled and chopped TV static sounds, and then I placed them directly over the percussive hits to not only pump the sound, but also add powerful textures to each impact. At the end of the song, I added a section where I chopped up a bunch of old cartoon samples from my childhood, and I wanted it to sound like you're switching between different TV channels.
Sokaklar bomboş.
I'm very particular about the mic recording techniques that I use. This is a vital point in my production process because a lot of what I do is recorded in real life. So taking into account natural reverb in its strongest meaning possible. In this section where I recorded the vocalist Ricardo Rivera, who is a professional opera singer, and he's the only vocalist on the record, besides some things that I've sampled of myself, but those are more sort of textures as a backdrop to the record. I recorded several layers of him singing the same verse in different and just affecting it differently, sort of just playing with the EQ or just driving frequencies in different ways. So you're hearing the same thing, just affected differently, and altogether it meshes in a really interesting way. Rather than using a digital reverb, I think details like that make for a very strong impact, and you can't really emulate that in a digital environment. I also like to generate interesting vocal effects by just running a sample through a low pass or a band pass filter with a fast LFO on the cutoff. Similarly, another really cool technique is to draw on micro-recordings in long tape delays and reverb effects and sort of just use it underneath the track as ambient textures. In general, I would say I try to emulate a sort of haunted church feel to the record, to the vocals in the record rather, and for the piano processing, almost a type of prepared piano vibe, really detuning everything and making it sound as wonky as possible, so it makes for very extraneous, sort of bizarre sounds. In the next song, the more standout facet would be the ring shifter modulation I used. I'm pretty content with the way the synth sound turned out here. Specifically the LFO oscillator and frequency cutoffs. And over here again, I have multiple layers of the same vocal that are just processed in different ways. I'm also pretty content with the way the drums turned out in this section. Instead of a stagnant drum loop, I disarranged everything and affected each layer using different filters and sort of dropping each piece in and out in a more randomized fashion, so it feels like there's a lot more momentum. I think marrying that with the modulation on the synth turned out pretty cool. And I really like the sort of rattling effect that you're hearing on the drums. I really hope you enjoyed the session with me today, and more so that you will enjoy the record itself. It's due for release this spring on Kingdom, so keep an eye out. Thank you so much for tuning in, and always remember, it's not about the gear you have, but how you use it. The final output is what matters.